and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to C tier for patch 11.9. As Set5 is still new, it's worth taking this tier list with a grain of salt. We're still seeing the meta evolve every single day, and on top of that, there's likely going to be a midway patch that is going to shake up parts of the meta. That said, we're basing this off of the current meta. Just keep in mind the meta is likely going to change. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our tier list, we have the synergies in S tier, which consists of Revenant, Hellion, God King, and Caretaker. These traits are almost must-haves every game, and you're guaranteed to see them used by multiple players. Up first, we have Revenant. Revenant is, at least in the current meta, the best frontline synergy. Ivern and Volibear are the reasons why, as both of them provide good crowd control, and since Revenant revives them, they're guaranteed to stall out the frontline for quite some time. In particular, having Revenant for Volibear ensures he'll cast at least once per fight, and how large his AoE is, you will always have guaranteed crowd control. Revenant also comes into play with Nocturne in the LeBlanc Assassin composition, as 3 Revenant is important for that composition to do well in the late game. All in all, when it comes to best potential frontline, Ivern and Volibear take the cake. Next up is Hellion. Hellion may not always be used in the late game, but early game? Oh, heck yeah! Ziggs, Kennen, and either Kled or Poppy is the most common early game you're going to see run in the current meta. Give Ziggs a Static Shiv or Kennen a Morellonomicon, and you've got yourself an easy win streak through Stage 2, and even potentially Stage 3. The sheer dominance of these champions early game makes them almost essential to be played in the meta, even though late game they have far less of a presence. The God Kings Darius and Garen have become a staple to late game frontlines. If you're running a composition that's centered around physical damage, toss in Darius. Magic damage? Garen. The armor or magic shred that they can do, plus their survivability and baseline damage, makes them one of the best additions to your comp late game. And lastly, we have Caretaker. In our Set5 PBE tier list, we had a few harsh words for Caretaker, and their issues are still prevalent. Heimer is reliant on the baby dragon, so if it dies, he has to waste time casting another. And targeting of the baby dragon is often not that great. But the reason Caretaker, meaning Heimerdinger, is in the S tier is the damage. Oh, the damage. Not only does Heimerdinger do a lot of damage, the dragon also applies a bit of healing reduction and when aimed properly, hits the majority of the enemy board. Despite a few shortcomings, Heimer has proved himself to be an essential piece to late game comps. Let's now move on to the A tier. This tier consists of Legionnaire, Nightbringer, Assassin, Ranger, Eternal, Draconic, Invoker, Cruel, Coven, Cavalier, and Knight. These synergies are the bread and butter of the meta. Most players will be using at least one of these synergies and can top 4 with them. At the top, we have Legionnaire. Legionnaire snuck its way into the meta after the first week of Set 5 being released. Basically, Mordekaiser single-handedly pulled this trait up by its bootstraps, and now the meta is rife with unkillable Mordekaisers. Of course, Draven does help do a bit of damage, but at the end of the day, the main reason Legionnaires are doing so well is because of Mordekaiser. This is one of the traits potentially getting nerfed in the upcoming B patch, so its place in the meta may shift. Next is Nightbringer. When you hear Nightbringer, it's likely you immediately thought of Aphelios. And yes, Aphelios is one of the best 4-cost carries currently. But Nightbringer is just an all-around solid trait because it prevents units from getting one-shot with the shield and boosts their damage. Plus, there's a lot of top-tier Nightbringer champions aside from Aphelios, such as Morgana, Lee Sin, Diana, and Darius. Diana in particular is one of the most contested champions as she devastates backline with her pull and Frozen Heart. Assassins are currently being hard carried by LeBlanc, though a lot of Assassins are good enough during the early and mid game. Kha'Zix, for example, can win streak you through Stage 2, and Katarina is surprisingly a reliable mid-game carry. Nocturne can be alright, but he doesn't hold a candle to the carry potential of LeBlanc. LeBlanc is likely to be nerfed in the upcoming B patch, so we'll have to wait and see how that affects the Assassin trait. Though at the end of the day, it still has Diana, which, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the most contested champions. Ranger, for the most part, just means Aphelios. There is carry Ashe and Draconic, and occasionally players reroll for Vayne 3. But Aphelios is the top dog along with his good friend Kindred. Unfortunately, 4 Ranger is not a thing in the meta, as 2 is just plenty. Speaking of Kindred, next we have Eternal. Kindred is one of the best 5-cost champions you can add to your board in the late game. It can be awkward to fit them in at times, but their ultimate, along with being a Mystic, makes them a key reason for winning late game fights. And Wolf, the extra unit you get from Eternal, does good damage and adds an extra body to your board, which is always helpful. Draconic is making waves for how easily players can hit 3-star champions with it. If you hit a strong enough Draconic board early on, it's possible to go Fast 9, find Heimer 2, and finish in the top 3. The main downside to Draconic is you want to ramp them up early, so finding them in the mid game is really not that useful. Invoker is by far the best splash trait in the game because increasing mana to all allied champions is absolutely massive. There's also the fact that Invoker has Ivern in it, meaning splashing in a second Invoker is quite easy to do. Syndra has good CC, Karma can carry, and Teemo will wreck late game boards. Since we mentioned him, let's talk about Teemo with Cruel. Cruel is, well, not that great when you consider Teemo costs you 6 health to buy, you only get 5 gold back from selling him, and he only appears in late game shops. So the majority of players by that point of the game won't even be able to make use of Teemo. But Teemo also does a ton of damage, can spam his ability with items, and the mushrooms slow enemy attack speed by a whopping 50%. So despite Cruel being lackluster, Teemo is not. Coven is hard to place because it is an essential piece to the LeBlanc composition. But LeBlanc doesn't need Coven to carry beyond the mid game. Coven is just a nice boost to her damage and helps her cast a bit more often. Outside of LeBlanc, Coven doesn't really do a whole lot. We have to give it a nod because of just how good LeBlanc is currently, which is why it gets a spot in the A tier. The last two traits are all about the frontline with Cavaliers and Knights. Both of these traits are the best options for the frontline throughout the game until players can run Ivern and Volibear. Even then, you're still going to see Rel used a lot because she's kind of ridiculously good. There's differences between these two traits, but at the end of the day, they have the same goal, which is to provide a frontline, so make sure you're using them if you're lacking a solid frontline. Let's move on to the B tier. This tier consists of Dawnbringer, Redeemed, Ironclad, Mystic, Skirmisher, Abomination, and Brawler. These traits are useful in the right situation, but are overall slightly below average. Up first is Dawnbringer. Dawnbringer is amazing early game thanks to Gragas and Kha'Zix. But the heal matters less and less as the game goes on, and in the current meta, a full Dawnbringer composition doesn't quite cut it against all of the other late game builds. That said, it does have Karma as a carry, and Garen is used a lot late game, so it's not completely forgotten in the later stages. Redeemed is interesting because it's good sometimes. The extra stats it provides are great, and you have access to one of the best champions in the game, Rel. But Vel'Koz doesn't need a full redeemed composition, and Kayle is far too inconsistent to rely on, so the trait doesn't end up being all that useful throughout the game. It can be good, but at the moment, it's not quite up to par with the other vertical traits. Ironclad is great as a splash trait when needed, otherwise doesn't do a whole lot. The main saving point for Ironclad is Rel, though fitting in 2 other units is difficult. Still, it's useful as a trait in the right situation. Mystic is in a similar position as Ironclad. Useful splash trait depending on if you need it or not. Kindred does make it easier to splash in Mystic late game, but for the most part, players only utilize Mystic when necessary. Skirmishers sadly don't do a whole lot in the meta. Kennen can carry early game, but that doesn't have much to do with the Skirmisher trait. Later on, Jax can be a carry, but being melee, he's not all that flexible, and he falls off. At best, if you're running a Skirmisher composition, you can hope for a top 4. Abomination hasn't found its groove yet in the meta since multiple nerfs it received during the PvE. The monstrosity can still win you rounds early on and can potentially even carry you into the late game, but more often than not, players don't bother committing to it because you have to play Nunu to hit 3 Abomination early. So in the right situation, the trait is good, but for the most part, you can just avoid using it. And our last trait for the B tier is Brawler. Brawler almost got placed in the C tier, but we do have to admit they have a place early game with Gragas, Warwick, and Set. Unfortunately, the trait just doesn't fit well into builds past the early game, even though Volibear is an essential late game champion. Basically, if you're looking to use Brawlers, stick to using them early game for your frontline. Alright, let's move on to the last tier, the C tier. This tier consists of Dragonslayer, Forgotten, Renewer, Spellweaver, and Verdant. Basically, these traits, well, don't do all that much in the current meta. Okay, we know it's odd to see Dragonslayer so far down after praising Mordekaiser and Diana so much. But let's be real, Dragonslayer as a trait doesn't do very much besides a small boost in ability power. Almost no one runs 4 Dragonslayer, and even though 2 is common, is the trait really doing all that much? Mordekaiser does well because of Legionnaire, items, and his ability. Diana also does well because she's an assassin that can CC the backline. In neither case does Dragonslayer make much of a difference either to them or the rest of your board where the effect is triggered. Forgotten at the moment is a bit forgotten in the meta. Sad fact is that they just don't scale well into late game because of all the bonus stats are in attack damage and ability power with 0 defensive stats, meaning the front line just gets shredded. And 3 Forgotten doesn't really add all that much value to the champions. We'll have to wait and see how they go about buffing Forgotten because it has the potential to be really good with Draven and Viego, but currently it falls short. Renewer is an odd trait. It's useful for helping units gain mana like Heimerdinger late game, but the healing only seems to matter in the early game where the damage is low and there's a lack of healing reduction. Once you hit the mid to late game, the healing just isn't enough to matter. It's certainly not the worst trait, but it has issues that they'll need to solve if they want it to be relevant beyond the early game and having it by happenstance when running Heimerdinger and Ivern. So Spellweaver has solid champions such as Ziggs, Zyra, and Vel'Koz, but the trait itself is rarely ever used and quite frankly just doesn't matter. The added ability power only affects the Spellweaver champions, which can be nice, but the amount increase is not enough to warrant running more than 2 of them. And for 2 Spellweavers, the increased ability power is fairly small. So there's almost no reason to use a Spellweaver trait besides early game with Ziggs, and even then, it's just not necessary. And the last trait on our tier list is Verdant. Verdant is, well, it can be useful sometimes. For instance, it can stop Volibear from stunning everything if his ability goes off early. But overall, the crowd control immunity just doesn't last long enough to matter. Even if you committed to 3 Verdants, which is a lot to commit, the duration is only 6 seconds. A lot of crowd control is going to happen after those first 6 seconds, making Verdant completely useless. And the biggest slap in the face of all for Verdant is that Zephyr goes through immunity. Basically, there's just no reason to run Verdant on purpose. And that's all we have for today's tier list video. Despite a few outliers, the overall meta is in a great place for a newly released set. But keep in mind, there is a midway patch coming, so expect a few shakeups when that arrives. Let us know in the comment section below which synergies you've had the most success with. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.